People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
It's a wonderful business opportunity, okay? You want climate, we'll give you climate.
There's a huge amount of money involved, and this is a huge, big money scam.
There are not just now billions, but there are trillions of dollars at stake.
It's a story of self-interest and big government funding.
People like me, our careers depend on funding of climate research. This is what I've been doing just about my whole career. This is what the other climate researchers are doing with their whole career. They don't want this to end.
If CO2 isn't having the huge negative impacts that we claimed it was having originally, how are we going to stay in business?
A lot of people's livelihoods depend on it. They're not going to give that up.
This is a story of the corruption of science.
There's no such thing as a climate emergency happening on this planet now. There's no evidence of one.
It's a story about the bullying and intimidation of anyone who dares to challenge the climate alarm.
To speak up against or about climate change in any sort of skeptical way was essentially career suicide.
Activists are even calling for any skepticism to be criminalized.
It's the story of an assault on individual freedom.
It's a wonderful way to increase government power. If there's an existential threat out there that's worldwide, well, you need a powerful worldwide government, to cope with it.
We see all these kind of authoritarian measures being adopted in the name of saving the planet.
You've suddenly got the population under control all over the world.
Computers have calculated what is in store for us as we produce and consume ever more. The weather will get worse. The planet will boil. We greedy humans must accept limits on our lifestyle. Consume less, travel less. Those who deny the climate crisis are not just wrong, they're dangerous, spreading the poison of doubt among a gullible population. These deniers should be shunned and shamed and censored. For these climate deniers are flat earthers. They are anti-science. Teaching at New York University is one of these climate deniers. Professor Stephen Koonin is one of America's leading physicists. He was a science advisor to President Obama and both vice president and provost of Caltech, one of the most prestigious scientific institutes in the world.
I teach climate science to my students at NYU, and I always tell them, check the data or the papers yourself. And they all come out of that course with their eyes wide open because I've been called a denier. And my response is, tell me what I'm denying, because I'm quoting from you directly from the official UN scientific reports.
Dick Lindzen also dismisses the claims of climate alarmists. He's one of the world's leading meteorologists, was professor of meteorology at both Harvard University and MIT, and has served on the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC.
Even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, if you go to their section on Working One, Group 1, which is the science, they don't support any of these claims. And I assure you, having served on it, it's biased, but you couldn't get any real scientists to agree some of the nonsense that's being promoted.
Will Happer is also a denier and is another of America's leading physicists. He has been science advisor to 3 presidents and professor of physics at both Columbia and Princeton University.
There's this mischievous idea that's promoted that scientific truth is determined by consensus. In real science, there are always arguments. No science is ever settled. It just is absurd when people say the science of climate is settled. It's not. There's no such thing as settled science, especially climate.
Dr. John Clauser is one of the most respected scientists in the world. In 2022, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics.
The science that's being done is appallingly bad, in my opinion. There are a large number of scientists who are in violent disagreement They refer to themselves as skeptics. Since I am no longer worried about losing funding or a job, whatever, I call myself a climate change denier.
These very eminent and respected scientists, and others like them, are not flat earthers. They do not deny science. So what's the evidence that has caused them to dismiss the climate alarm as nonsense? The longest instrumental record of temperature in the world comes from central England, and this is what it shows. Since the worst of the Little Ice Age, from 1650, the temperature has risen, gently, by little more than 1 degree Celsius.
There's no doubt that warm is better than cold in geological history. We are a tropical species. A human being in the shade, naked, dies at 20 C from hypothermia. We evolved on the equator in Africa, and the only reason we were able to get out of there eventually was fire, shelter, and clothing.
Suburbs have spread. There are more roads, more cars. Thermometers which were once outside towns are now surrounded by shopping malls, offices, factories, and houses.
These towns and all the locations where thermometers are located, on average, they've all grown in population, let's say since 1880. You've got buildings growing up around the thermometers, you've got parking lots, so you've got all of these non-climate influences which are affecting the temperatures, which raises questions about the quality of thermometer data for monitoring global warming.
According to rural temperature records, temperatures rose from the 1880s but peaked in the 1940s. Then there was a marked cooling until the 1970s. After that, temperatures recover, but are still today barely higher than they were in the 1940s. It's not just rural thermometers that show little warming. Merchant ships and other naval vessels have been measuring the temperature of the sea since the 19th century. In red, we see the land temperature record since the 1860s, which has been inflated by urban thermometers. But in blue is the ocean temperature record. From around 1900, the two begin to diverge. Ocean records show far less warming in the 20th century, and the pattern more closely resembles the rural temperature record. Scientists have also studied temperature change by looking at tree rings, which again shows very little warming. There's a gentle rise till the mid-20th century, a cooling to the 1970s, followed by a mild recovery. Once again, it shows temperatures today are barely different to those of the 1930s and 40s, and the pattern closely resembles rural temperatures. Satellites, too, seem to be telling a different story. Our ability to measure global temperature accurately took a leap forward when satellites began to orbit the Earth. One of the scientists who pioneered the use of satellites to measure temperature is Dr. Roy Spencer, who in the 1980s was senior scientist for climate at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center.
We were discussing over lunch, isn't there some way we can use satellites to monitor global temperatures? Because, as you know, the temperature network of thermometers is pretty skimpy around the world, so it's kind of hard to get a global temperature.
Dr. Spencer's development of weather satellites was revolutionary. He and his colleague, Professor John Christie, have been awarded NASA's Medal for Exceptional Scientific Achievement.
Our satellite data begins in January of 1979. That's when we have complete global coverage, and we have it right up to the present.
There was one critical question about temperature that satellites were singularly well equipped to answer.
Has there been a spurious warming that has crept into the global temperature record over land that's just a result of an increase in population? And that's something that we've been analyzing and working a lot on lately, and we're finding that, especially in urban areas, it's large. I mean, since 1880, most of the warming, it looks like, is due to the urban heat island effect.
We're lucky to have a few independent scientists like John Christie and Roy Spencer with their satellite measurements of temperature. You know, before they started releasing this, ground-based temperature records were going wild. They were going up, you know, like crazy with no bounds. But now they have to contend with the fact that there's this independent and probably better way of measuring the whole globe's temperature, which is not alarming at all.
Evidence from multiple sources now agree that the official global temperature record, as used by world governments and reported in the world's media, is showing far too much warming over the last 120 years, artificially inflated by urbanization.
You look at the weather balloon record, the satellite record, the rural record, the ocean record doesn't warm nearly as much as land. All of these indications show that the big warming pulse in the record is the Northern Hemisphere land record. And that's also where most of this data contamination is happening.
But of the mild warming that has taken place in the last 300 to 400 years, can any of it be attributed to human emissions of CO2? Professor Henrik Svensmark is visiting the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and taking a stroll in the Evolution Garden, dedicated to preserving the oldest surviving plant species on Earth. These plants aren't just pleasing on the eye. They can also tell us about levels of CO2 in the atmosphere in Earth's geological past.
What we have here is a ginkgo tree, and it's actually a living fossil in the sense that this type of tree first appeared about 270 million years ago. On the underside of the leaf, there are what we call stomata, the cells where they can uptake CO2. So they're actually measuring how much CO2 is in the air, and then they adjust the number of these stomata to how much CO2 there is. And by looking at fossils and measuring how many there are at a different time, it says something about what was the level of CO2 back in time.
So when we look back in time, what do we find? Over almost all of the last 500 million years, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere has been far, far higher than it is now. Even with modern industry's contribution to CO2 levels, by geological standards, the level of atmospheric CO2 today is close to being as low as it has ever been.
20,000 years ago, CO2 is at the lowest level it has ever been in the history of the Earth, 180 parts per million. If it had gone down another 30 parts per million, we'd all be dead.
There is a low point of CO2 where photosynthesis becomes so inefficient that plant life would die. Then everything else starts to perish after that.
There's good evidence that in many parts of the world there was plant starvation from not enough CO2. So we should be very grateful that CO2 levels are beginning to go back up. We're still far from the historical norms, which would be several thousand parts per million. There's not enough fossil fuel to get there, but at least we're making a start.
If it were true that higher levels of CO2 caused higher temperatures, we should be able to see that in Earth's climate history. Here, scientists are drilling into ancient ice cores. These cores tell us both about past temperatures and CO2 levels. Scientists have indeed found a link between temperature and CO2. The trouble is, it's the wrong way round.
It's long been known that the temperature actually moves first. So temperature goes up, CO2 goes up after that. Temperature goes down, CO2 goes down.
Ice ages start when carbon dioxide is at its maximum, and ice ages end when carbon dioxide is at its minimum, which is the exact opposite of what would occur if carbon dioxide was controlling the temperature.
The question of whether CO2 drives the climate is easily resolved. You can look back in time over hundreds of millions of years. CO2 levels have changed radically many times. Did this cause temperature change? No, absolutely not. CO2 has never driven temperature changes in the past, never.
Nor is it clear in recent times that CO2 is having any effect on temperature. Here we see industrial output of CO2 since 1750. From the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, there was only a slight increase. It's not until the 1940s that industrial production of CO2 begins to take off. But this doesn't match the temperature record. According to rural thermometers, most of the warming in the past 200 years occurred before the 1940s, and have barely changed since then.
One of the embarrassments that IPCC doesn't like to talk about was that the 1930s, when human influences were much smaller, were particularly warm.
That's the puzzle, that the first early part where we have such a sharp warming from the 1900s to 1930s and 1940s, CO2 could never cause that temperature rise.
But the 1930s and early 40s were so hot is puzzling. More puzzling still is what happened next.
By the end of World War II, CO2 was really going up, and yet the temperature was going down.
From 40 to 70, while the CO2 continued to rise, this thing started to cool. What happened?
Journalists were writing about the coming ice age. It was on the cover of Time magazine.
All climate models are based on the assumption that CO2 drives temperature change. But actual observations and historical evidence clearly suggest that it doesn't.
Yes, I assert that there is no connection whatsoever between CO2 and climate change. That's all a crock of crap, in my opinion.
There is no truth to the idea that the Earth is warmer now than it has been in the past. It's a lie. There is no truth that CO2 is higher than it should be. That is a lie.
Astrophysicist Willie Soon decided to look again at the rural temperature record for the past 150 years. Then he looked at a record of changes in solar activity over the same period. To Dr. Soon, it was obvious that it was the sun, not CO2, that was driving temperature.
As of 2023, IPCC says is that the sun have absolutely zero chance to explain the changes of the climate system on a broad scale, let's say global warming or northern hemisphere. We say no. We can easily demonstrate the sun can explain all of it. There's zero for the CO2, 100% for the sun. How's that?
You've now had decades of putting the idea in people's heads that any time the weather is bad, it's climate change and greenhouse gases. So I think people at this point can't help themselves. If you have a heat wave, immediately everybody's thinking, oh, what have we done to the weather?
What about the increasing number of wildfires we're often told about?
If you look at the actual number of forest fires from satellite observations, the actual number is going down.
Here is an estimate of global wildfires since 1900. It shows a clear decline. And here is a record of areas affected by wildfires in the US. It shows that wildfires were far, far worse in the 1930s. How about hurricanes? The US has by far the best record of hurricane activity in the world. Over the past 120 years, there is no overall change. In fact, the trend is slightly down.
There's no such thing as a climate emergency happening on this planet now. There's no evidence of one.
Yeah, the extreme weather event story is just absurd. There's no basis to it at all. It's just based on propaganda. The actual data shows the opposite.
I've shown you the official data, the official science. Tell me what I'm denying.
The climate alarm is nonsense. You know, it's a hoax. I've never liked hoax. I think scam is a better word, but I'm willing to live with hoax.
But why are we told, again and again, that man-made climate chaos is an undisputed scientific fact, beyond question, beyond doubt? To answer this, we must examine the so-called consensus on climate change.
Thank you very much.
Until the 1980s, global warming was little more than an eccentric scare story put about by radical environmentalists. But then the cause was picked up by an ambitious young senator, Al Gore, who would soon become vice president. $1 billion a year of public money was made available for research into climate change. This quickly rose to $2 billion.
Up to that level.
Academic researchers in various disciplines began to apply for this climate funding.
If you want to qualify for money that's labeled climate, well, you take whatever you're doing and you add a little bit of climate speak to it, and away you go.
You're dealing with the sexual habits of cockroaches. You'll add, and the impact of climate.
So all I have to do is add a little wrinkle to my grant application to explain how, well, I'm worried that climate change will mean the death of all the maple trees. And so right away you qualify for funding.
Academics of every kind lined up for climate funding. Climate became an exciting new area of interest for sociologists, biologists, professors of English literature, lecturers in gender studies, and many more.
And it also served to create a community. I mean, you know, you've become a climate scientist now. even though you know nothing about the physics of climate.
Thousands of papers were published on climate change and prostitution, climate change and beer, climate change and the Black Death, climate change and disability, climate change and video games, and everything else imaginable.
There's an almost comical list of studies out there. Just do a Google search on climate change and everything comes up.
Scientific research in the United States tends to be dominantly funded by government grants. And so whatever government grants are offered sort of determine much of the science being done.
The United States Congress only funds problems, okay? Research into problems.
It's always been a problem to support your research or your existence, or raison d'etre. And so climate was a godsend.
If Congress is willing to pay you to find evidence of global warming, by golly, as a scientist, we're going to go find evidence of it, because that's what we're being paid to do. And guess what? If you don't find evidence, or say the evidence suggests it's not a problem, your funding ends. This totally corrupts the way we look at the science.
Who was the famous gangster asked, "Why do you rob banks?" And he said, "Well, because that's where the money is."
The climate alarm brought funds, and the bigger the supposed threat, the more funds seemed to flow. The publicly funded science establishment now had a direct financial interest in playing up the alarm.
So there's a huge incentive to over-exaggerate or to speak in hyperbole, even if the data doesn't support exactly what you're saying, because that's what brings the funds. I was in that boat. I was someone that was defending climate change as a grad student quite a bit, because the truth is I didn't give it too much thought, but I thought, well, it's getting a ton of attention. It brings a ton of money into the earth sciences. Even if I don't buy all the hyperbole, what's the problem?
By the late 1990s, what had started as an environmental scare story was gaining momentum. Green subsidies and regulation meant there was now money to be made in climate. Renewables firms sprouted. Consultancy firms offered advice on what they called sustainability and climate compliance.
It's a wonderful business opportunity, okay? You want climate, we'll give you climate.
The renewables industry alone now turns over $1 trillion a year, and that's expected to double in the next few years.
What used to be a cottage industry is now blossomed to become a major part of the world economy.
The growth of this climate industry has seen an explosion of highly paid green jobs. Chief sustainability officers, carbon offset advisors, ESG consultants, climate compliance lawyers, and countless others. At the last gathering of the publicly funded UN's IPCC, 70,000 delegates flew in from around the world. Government bureaucrats, green NGOs, carbon sequestration consultants, environmental journalists, heads of renewables companies. All the jobs, all of the funding, are totally dependent on there being a climate crisis.
If CO2 isn't having the huge negative impacts that we claimed it was having originally, how are we going to stay in business? How do we justify our existence if climate change isn't this existential threat that we claimed it was over the last 4 decades or so?
People like me, our careers depend on funding of climate research. This is what I've been doing just about my whole career. This is what the other climate researchers are doing with their whole career. They don't want this to end.
If NASA said global warming's not a problem, where does their funding disappears, right? So they can't say that. I mean, you've got the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. If they said the climate isn't changing, they'd have no reason to exist.
The IPCC has a self-preservation instinct to show that climate change is an existential threat. Otherwise, there's no reason for them to be collecting the money and doing the work in the first place.
There are not just now billions, but there are trillions of dollars at stake.
There's a huge amount of money involved. This is a huge, big money scam. A lot of people's livelihoods depend on it. They're not going to give that up.
If suddenly the notion becomes apparent that this is not such a problem, you're going to see that as an existential threat.
Scientists who studied the natural causes of climate change began to be viewed with suspicion, as two Harvard astrophysicists discovered.
When we started to estimate that the sun changed by quite significantly in terms of climatic sense, immediately the attack is there. Because it's not following the narrative, because they need the CO2 to be the only one, the only dominant player.
When you try to say, well, gee, we're just looking for the background of natural variability, the response would be, we can't have natural changes as an effect. It has to be human-caused.
It's gotten to where it has nothing to do with the science anymore. It doesn't matter if your alarmist prediction doesn't come true, you're still going to retain your status as an expert, and the media is still going to come and ask you for your opinion, even though you were crazy wrong about your predictions.
Dr. Matthew Wailicki was an assistant professor of geology at the University of Alabama when he decided to speak out about the climate scare. As a result of the backlash, he has decided to leave teaching.
To speak up about climate change in any sort of skeptical way was essentially career suicide, absolutely. There was no possible way that I would publish in quite a few of the mainstream journals that I was required to publish in. I essentially isolated myself from many of the funding institutions. This is one of the reasons you can build a consensus in a community, is because anybody who is skeptical of that consensus essentially gets kicked out of the community.
Speaking out in scientific ways that go contrary to the consensus, I would say is a career killer for people at the early stage of their careers.
You have to go along with the global warming story. If you don't, you're going to get cut off, you're going to lose funding, you're going to get your career ruined, you're going to be trashed by the community, you'll be despised by your coworkers.
When you can't talk about the facts, things become corrupt.
If you shut the door on ideas, if you say you're not allowed to test it, you're not allowed to have that idea, you've left the realm of science.
It's clear it's now a cult that completely divorced from science.
Global warming is like the perfect problem that government can get involved in to grow the influence of government.
Suppose 20 years ago somebody had hatched the idea that I would really like to ban cheap energy. I'd really like to control everybody's appliance purchases. I'd really like to tell everybody where they can go. And basically, I'd like to have dictatorial control over everything. Well, it's not going to fly. No, everybody would think you're a nut and would ignore you. But fast forward 20 years, that's what's happening.
The publicly funded establishment in the West is so large and powerful. It is able to impose and enforce the official consensus on climate through its control of schools, universities, government, and much of the media. State broadcasters like the BBC exclude climate skeptics.
If you're a professional of any kind in science or law or medicine, if you belong to a professional association or you are in a university, you can be fired for saying what you believe.
But climate alarmists have a problem. Many countries in Africa and across Asia are simply ignoring the environmentalist demands of Western governments and international agencies. China now uses more coal than the rest of the world combined.
Which is one of the reasons why this whole climate agenda is falling apart, because the rest of the world is not cutting emissions, is not moving to renewables.
Ordinary people are not stupid. They have seen one ridiculous claim after another fail over and over. What this does is leave people with a profound and justified cynicism about what the scientific establishment says and about what the government says.